Why, hello, how are you? Oh, well, I'm so glad to see you back for our latest book. Now, we went a little bit too close to the 19th century for my liking, and then it all got a little bit too polite last time. Yes, so we've gone back the other way. We've gone well back to the early days, and we have a nice, excellent slut. I will explain why I keep using that word. But first, before we start, Her Infernal Majesty has a little message for you. Helen Forster, Julia Caesar, everybody loves Caesar, Kate and Petruchio, there's Romeo and Juliet, the Milwaukee Family Players. And they are all available on the Black Cockie Press shop. So you should all go over there and buy them. And you can also remember to sign up for our newsletter, and that there are all sorts of other products and books on the website to help with your writing. So that little bit out of the way, she's very pleased about the t-shirts, honestly. You've never, ever seen anyone that pleased. But on with this novel. And this novel is Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Now, when I began the book club back in 2020, yes, 2020, when I was explaining the novel, I talked about the fact that the 18th century sees women becoming the focus of novels, and actually women writing novels, which was not something we had seen in earlier periods. You hadn't seen women and the lives of women centered. And today we have the life of a woman centered. We have Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Or more correctly, because of the way that this was published, the fortunes and misfortunes of the famous Moll Flanders, who was born in Newgate and during a life of continued variety for 70 years besides her childhood, was 12 years a whore, 5 times a wife, wherefore once to her own brother, 12 year a thief, 8 years a transported felon in Virginia, at last grew rich, lived honoured, and died penitent. Written from her own memorandum. Okay. She's quite a character, is Moll Flanders. Now, the reason the title is so big is because that was on the front cover of the book, and that was used to entice people to buy it. So Moll Flanders has a scandalous life. She has an absolutely scandalous life. A lot of people don't like Moll Flanders because they don't like the choices she makes. I loved Moll Flanders, and I think a lot of English readers also quite love Moll Flanders. I look at the end of that big long description of the book, and the died a penitent is like, yeah, right. No, she didn't. Tell them they're dreaming. Tell them they're dreaming. She didn't die a penitent. She is a shrewd and resourceful woman. And a time when being a shrewd and resourceful woman was what you had to be to absolutely survive in this world, because she is a woman of no fortune. She is born in Newgate Prison. Her mother is a condemned felon who has pled the fact that she's pregnant to evade being hanged. When the baby is born, Moll, which isn't her real name, but she doesn't use her real name, but when she is born, she is given to a friend, and her mother is transported to Virginia as a convict. So Moll comes from very, very straitened circumstances. In her childhood, she is briefly captured by gypsies. She comes under the protection of a woman in one of the parishes who takes in orphans. She then she is quite terrified of going into service. She does not want to be a servant, which is the normal sort of lifestyle for somebody like Moll. Is she would just be put into service, which is pretty much akin to slavery. Like, I mean, it's slightly different, but it's pretty close to. And, you know, as a little girl, she's like, no, I don't want that life. She is seen as such a curiosity that she becomes the plaything of the mayor's daughters, who she eventually comes to live with as sort of like a companion, which is actually a paid position. It's a sort of servant. So she's like a chambermaid and companion to these girls. And at 18, their elder brother, well, she discovers what happens to servant girls in households. And this isn't even a particularly rich household. This isn't an aristocratic household. This is just a middle-class household. She discovers what happens to servant girls. They get seduced. She is seduced by the elder brother, and she does do something that I will discuss more later. She blames herself, and it's like, sweetie, he's a seducer. He wanted sex and he was going to get it. I mean, he's quite nice about it. He's a very nice young man, but he's still using a power imbalance and a promise of marriage to get what he wants right now. And she eventually marries his younger brother, who has fallen in love with her and wants to marry her, actually intends to marry her, although she doesn't love him. She is persuaded by her lover, the elder brother, to marry the younger. And so this looks like, oh, look, Moll is set up. She's married into the middle classes. She should be fine. She has a couple of children. And then 5 years after her wedding or her marriage, he dies. And she is left with very little. The family take the children, and she is back out in the world. Her second husband, she marries because he has money, not because she loves him, but because he has money and she has none. She has very little in the way of ways to get around in the world, to actually make her way in the world. It's very, very difficult for her. And she marries a man who goes bankrupt. So again, she is thrust out into the world with very few resources. She is young. She is pretty. She is clearly a witty and charming person because her narrative is very witty and charming. And so she, once again, look for another husband. Her husband is fled to France to avoid the bankruptcy, and she is, okay. And he actually tells her, consider our marriage over, consider yourself a widow, consider yourself free to marry again. So she's like, okay, now I need to catch another husband. Turns out where she is isn't so great at catching a husband, but eventually she does. She does find another husband who has estates in Virginia. He has plantations in Virginia, and they go out to Virginia. When she's in Virginia, having been several years married, having 3 children, one of whom died, Moll does leave children behind her, quite a few children. Having discovered this, she discovers that she has inadvertently married her half-brother. His mother is her mother, which she only discovers because her mother tells the story of how she came to Virginia. And eventually she is forced to tell her brother the truth, because she cannot bear the idea of going to bed with him again, and it's just, oh no, this is terrible. They come to, you know, obviously the marriage can't be considered legal, not that it technically was anyway, because she wasn't divorced or widowed before, so she has a whole load of bigamous marriages from now on. And he agrees to give her a settlement and go back to England, and, you know, no contact, and then eventually he will put about that she was killed, or she had died, and then he can be free to marry again. Her mother promises to leave her an estate of some kind, a plantation of some kind, if she can. In Bristol, having lost most or all of the cargo that she was given by her brother husband, she is again thrown onto the mercy of the meat market of Bath, where she meets a gentleman who has a wife who is mad, and she becomes for about 5 years his mistress. She has a little boy by him, but eventually he falls ill and recants of their adulterous relationship. She gives the child to him and leaves. So that's 4 husbands now, or 4 down now. She has a very eventful life. She's not quite finished. She doesn't consider herself down and out yet. She's still got her charms. She then meets a banker who she is entrusting to invest her money. He is divorcing his wife and would like her to hang about until then. But she has also been given an offer to go into the North Country, up to Lancashire, to live more cheaply than in London. She goes there, and then she is conned into a marriage with a highwayman who she calls her Lancashire husband. This actually turns out to be the great love of Moll's life. This is actually the partner that she deserves, and that who is actually good for her, but neither of them have any money, and they are forced to separate in spite of the fact that they love each other. She returns to find the banker has had his divorce, and she marries the banker. By the time he dies, she's had 2 more children. We don't know what has happened to them. And she also had a child by her Lancashire husband, whom she sold. She sold to the midwife to sell on to a wealthy family. So we have quite an eventful life. By the time her banker husband has died, Moll finds that, well, she's hit menopause, she's 48, and she's like, I don't think I can get a husband anymore. I don't have that commodity of youth, beauty, and an ability to bear children. Because she has a lot of children. She loses a lot of children, like loses contact with a lot of her children. Whether they survived or not, she doesn't know. She then turns thief, and she turns out to be a very good thief, very, very good thief. And of course, this being this period, she frames it as, oh, it's so terrible, I had to turn thief. You know, I think people object to this. They object to the choices that she make, that couldn't she do something honest? But there is very little honest work that is not leading a woman to live in utter destitution. Honest work was very, very poorly paid. honest work was not something that could give you any sort of quality of life. And she is honestly having to work hard. She works really hard. She has, you know, marrying men, catching men, pleasing men, and being dependent on men is a really hard life. Because she has had husbands who are feckless, who just through poor luck die before her and leave nothing to her. That is the most important thing. She is never independently wealthy. She is never independently wealthy or even independently stable. She has absolutely nothing to fall back on except her looks, her charm, and her ability to nick stuff. She's rather like Manon in that way. And you could argue, yes, there were plenty of women who worked honestly. Yes, there were plenty of women who married well. But these are the choices Moll makes. And that's why it's a fun story. So I don't understand why people would object to that, because if she didn't make these choices, then she wouldn't be the interesting person that she is. She's also... so she becomes a thief. She gets eventually caught and ends up being transported. Her Lancashire husband has also been caught, and he volunteers for transport. So they both end up on the same ship. Now, Moll is very cunning. She has actually, even though she's been caught and convicted of thievery, she has managed to still get brought on board a whole load of her booty. She has money. She has commodities. And she and her Lancashire husband have also been able to get themselves under the captain's protection. So although here we have Moll Flanders, convicted felon, she has managed to wheedle her way into a better position. When they get to Virginia, she and her Lancashire husband do look for a plantation. They do meet up with her son by her brother husband. Awkward. She doesn't put it about that she is married because she doesn't want this to be really openly seen yet. She is a very canny manipulator of people. She has to be. That's how she survived this long. She is exceptionally canny at manipulating people. She ends up coming into the estate that her mother left her, and she ends her life a woman with a stable financial position, a husband who loves her, and ignore the fact that it says, you know, they were penitent for their previous crimes. She is a great performer and she knows what to say to get what she wants. And thus, I respect that entirely. This is a book that's very much like Tom Jones in terms of its big rollicking story. But unlike Tom Jones, you see the double standard that comes with being a woman, because her use of sex is actually more strategic, and she's very much more a monogamous person. She's not adulterous in terms of cheating on her men, but she uses it to get that stability. She uses, I have something that I know men want. I'm going to use that to get some stability in my life. Unfortunately for her, a lot of this, she has no ability to have financial stability independent of men. Not until the very end of her life does she gain that. And that's quite difficult for her. And you see the failure of a system that relies on marry well and your man will look after you. Well, honey, a man is not a plan, and Moll can tell you that for absolute certain. A man is not a plan. You need to be able to earn your own income, and you need to be able to earn an income that keeps you above destitution. which was not on offer for women. They couldn't become bankers and lawyers and doctors. They could become maids. They could maybe work in a shop, but not really, because those positions were almost always taken by family members of shopkeepers. There was not a lot on offer. There was seamstress work, and seamstress work, like garment work, has always been a notoriously underpaid, overworked job. There is no option for Moll to gain any level of independence, gain any level of dignity, except to use her sexuality in that way, and then to steal when that's no longer an option. So it's a really interesting book in that regard. It's a very, very fun book. She is a very engaging and witty character, and she's also telling us her story. So she is an unreliable narrator. She's a deeply, deeply, deeply unreliable narrator, because she is doing exactly what she has done her entire life, which is gauge her audience and tell the story accordingly. This is her great talent. She is not reliable. We don't know to what extent she's not reliable, because we're not given any real outside counterpoint to understand where she is unreliable, but her protestations of, oh, I was forced into it, and it was against my scruples. I'm like, I think there you're stretching it a bit, because you're appealing to that genteel audience that wants to believe, oh yes, we repent, and I'm telling you about how I stole things so that you can protect yourself from thieves. There is a lot of positioning herself in a way to appear the penitent, repentant character, which she isn't. She is absolutely this little cat that has landed on her feet yet again and got away with multiple 9 of her 9 lives. She is witty and engaging. So, and that would be why I think you should read Moll Flanders. Daniel Defoe writes in a very almost journalistic fashion. It's not that, and I mean, and for 1722, no writer had that deep internal world of characters. That just does not exist at this time. But you do notice that with Moll Flanders, it reads very fast. Some of the 18th century books that we've looked at are quite dense, and you're like, oh my goodness, we're churning through this thing. But this one it really clips along really nicely, and that makes it a lot more accessible, even though it's 300 years old, to a modern reader. It's more accessible than some of the other things that we have read that are more modern. You're not going to get something like Pride and Prejudice. You're not getting a Jane Austen. You are getting a rollicking slut. And I say slut. Slut is actually an 18th century word. I'm not using slut as a pejorative comment on her sexuality. That would be whore. And she uses whore herself, that she is usually an honest wife, and only once is she a whore, legitimately a whore. I mean, her bigamous marriages make her a whore, but as she sees it, she's only really been a whore first for the seducing lover, and the time she was the mistress. But she doesn't count herself as a whore. She would actually be quite, that she has been married. It wasn't her fault these husbands sort of turned out to be unreliable, her brother, and bankrupt and whatnot. So in her defense, she would say that. But she is a slut. And in the 18th century, a slut is a low-born woman, a servant, a very lowly born woman. So she is a slut in that regard. She is not a slattern, which is like a low-born woman, but with like who's lower morals, but also a certain level of low decency, not just morals, but decency. Moll is always respectable. She always looks respectable. She knows how to present herself so that she can present in polite society, even if what she is a counterfeit in polite society. She's not disheveled. She's not wearing poor clothing. She invests. And that's the other thing you find with this book. This book is absolutely filled with money. She is so obsessed with money. Every time she goes through over and over and over again how much she's been left with, how long she can live on it, and how quickly she needs to find new support, and how much does the new person have as a fortune. It is a book where the material reality is center stage. Her desire for money is not so much avaricious as this is how much one needs to survive. And so that's the other really striking thing about this, is how much it talks about money. Money is so important. If you thought that Pride and Prejudice with 10,000 a year was talking quite a bit about money, Moll Flanders is so much more. She is so aware of the cost of maintaining, not advancing. She actually very rarely attempts to advance. She is just trying to maintain a certain level, a standard of living, a standard of comfort that, in all honesty, can you really, really condemn her for not wanting to become destitute? She spends a lot of time, a lot of effort maintaining a level of life, a standard of living that is comfortable rather than destitute or difficult. So money is such a big thing in this book. It's a very fascinating book. You probably won't see anything that talks about money in this way, that talks so pragmatically about how difficult this sort of life is. It is a very interesting book. The one thing I would say is this story, her life, is supposed to span most of the 17th century and not the contemporary of 1722, but the 16s. Yet the biggest thing in the 16s is not mentioned. The biggest thing of the Civil War and the Interregnum and the Restoration are not mentioned, which is kind of a rather interesting thing. Defoe is writing this long life, but he is not interested in a political world outside of her life. It is a life that is almost entirely insulated from anything that is actually happening in the world. So that was the other striking thing, is that if you read it, you would imagine that the whole life is in the 18th century. But it's not. It's in the 17th century, and none of the big, massive upheavals of the 17th century are mentioned, which is it is an interesting facet of the book. Now, again, I told you that the 18th century has female authors, and we have only done one, and we were disappointed by that because Mary Wollstonecraft is not a great fiction writer, unfortunately. So we're going to have another go with The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. So it's a bit of a thick one again. I will, of course, have a link down below so that you can read it on Project Gutenberg. And when I see you again, we will be reading The Female Quixote, which is basically it's a play on Don Quixote, but 18th century, and finally a woman writer. So I will, until we meet again, goodbye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.